Ancient Egypt. For millennium, it has captured the imaginations, hearts, and minds of generations of truth seekers, eager to know who really built the pyramids, when they were built, and why they were built.
This documentary series is comprehensive. It's the biggest documentary series ever made about ancient Egypt. This documentary series will not only rewrite the history of ancient Egypt, it will turn the history of the human race upside down. So come with me as we go down the Nile and we discover the truth beneath the sands of Egypt. Ever since I was a child, I had a fascination with ancient Egypt. Any book, any documentary, I watched it, I read everything. But every time I saw it or I read it, something about what the Egyptologists were telling me didn't ring true. And for years and years and years, like a big jigsaw puzzle, I tried to put the pieces together. And I tried to put them together the way the Egyptologists had them. But the picture didn't make sense. And then I came to Egypt and I saw the evidence for myself. And the picture started to take a different shape. So come with me as we go down the Nile and we discover the truth beneath the sands of Egypt. Welcome to our exploration of the First Intermediate Period. In episode 11, we examined the 6th Dynasty, a period in which various family members laid claim to the throne. Provincial governors started amassing their own power as nomarchs, building their own armies, constructing their own tombs, and where the power over the people shifted away from the throne and into the hands of the priests, with religion assuming a position as the dominant force in society. In episode 12, before we could even cast a glance at the 7th to 12th dynasties, the evidence we examined on Elephantine Island and in the tomb of the nobles just down the river led us to discover the massive influence the meteorite impacts, volcanic eruptions, and subsequent global climate changes caused by the floods and droughts associated with the 4.2 Kiloyear event, not only on the end of the Old Kingdom and the unfolding history of ancient Egypt, but on other famous archaeological sites such as Stonehenge. In part 1 of this episode, we're going to investigate the effects of those climate changes on the history of ancient Egypt, on the people, and the 7th to the early 12th dynasties, referred to as the First Intermediate Period.
Towards the end of the Old Kingdom, the positions of the nomarchs had become hereditary, meaning families retained the position of power in their respective provinces. And, as these nomarchs grew increasingly powerful and influential, they became more independent from the king, erecting tombs in their own domains. That, together with the lengthy reign of the 6th dynasty pharaoh Pepi II and the lack of an heir, undermined the central government. And, after his passing, the Old Kingdom collapsed and the nation descended into an unstable period of anarchy and chaos, during which these nomarchs often raised their own armies, inevitably creating conflicts between neighbouring provinces that often resulted in intense rivalries and warfare between them, in which temples were pillaged and violated. Artwork was vandalized, and the statues of kings were broken or destroyed as a result of the postulated political chaos.
That I can believe, but where is the evidence?
This period, known as the First Intermediate Period, 2181 to 2040 BCE, a name given to it, not by the ancient Egyptians but coined in 1926 by Egyptologists George Steindorf and Henri Frankfurt for a period comprising the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, and part of the 11th dynasties, was long labelled by those same 19th century Egyptologists as a Dark Age, mainly because of the lack of art and architecture. But perhaps the most significant barrier to understanding the First Intermediate Period is their almost complete absence of reliable historical records. And what information we do have is sketchy and often contradictory.
Surely this is because the government kept the record, and because most of the populace couldn't write. So no government, no records. But why? More recent scholarship has distanced itself from considering the period as a dark age, instead seeing the First Intermediate Period as a time of change and transition, where two opposing cities, northern Heracleopolis and southern Thebes, contended for control of a decentralized Egypt, where an increase in the power of local nomarchs and local customs replaced the central monarchy at Memphis. Thus Egypt was left with no central administration, and where preserving history may not have been a priority of the separate regions.
The most important concept to ancient Egyptians was harmony, mat, and the time of the First Intermediate Period was far from harmonious. Egyptian history up until this time focused on the king and his accomplishments, and the king had been seen as a representative of the gods, as a son of God, who maintained harmony in the lives of his subjects as a divine mandate, and the Egyptians felt that
people would be helpless without their rulers. Left on their own, they would simply not be able to face the hazards of life.
However, with the decline of centralized power, the old order of a king and central government was replaced by the regional governments of the nomarchs, even though, in the early years of this era, the kings still tried to govern from Memphis. As the king's power became increasingly diminished, the separate regions flourished, the old paradigm was upset, and the common people of Egypt, men proud of their own localities and intensely loyal to the local rulers, took center stage, providing for their welfare while maintaining social order, leaving behind their own stories, short biographies of their achievements, limited as they are, engraved on stele in or outside their tombs.
If they were tombs, my contention is they were administrative buildings. The difficulty is the evidence even of the kings is almost non-existent. And what evidence there is almost completely unreliable.
A severe drought, coupled with the lack of a strong central government and the friction between Lower and Upper Egypt caused by the rise of the power of the priesthood, and the lack of a successor to the long-lived Pepi II, brought about the collapse of the political structure of the Old Kingdom and moved Egypt into the First Intermediate Period.
And the 4.2 Kiloyear event certainly played its part in triggering all of that. Floods, droughts, darkened skies blocking the sun.
The dour perception of the First Intermediate Period has long been dominated by the negative image presented in some Middle Kingdom works, some of the earliest examples of Egyptian literature. One example being the Lamentations of Apua, an Egyptian sage, another the Teachings for King Merakara, written by the last king of the 10th dynasty. In the past, it had been suggested that Apua the sage served as a treasury official during the last years of Pepi II Neferker's reign. Thus the Apua papyrus was thought by some to describe the collapse of the Old Kingdom and the beginning of the Dark Age, known to historians as the First Intermediate Period. Modern research suggests that the papyrus dates to the much later 13th dynasty, with part of the papyrus now thought to date to the time of Pharaoh Kheti, and the admonitions of Ipu were actually being addressed to the god Atum, not a mortal king. The admonitions are thought to hearken back to the First Intermediate Period and record a decline in international relations and a general impoverishment in Egypt. In the most famous of these works are the Lamentations of E-Puwer, long held to be set in the time of the First Intermediate Period and known as the pessimistic texts. The author paints a picture of gloom and doom, lamenting the depths to which the country has fallen. And this interpretation has greatly influenced scholars and historians in the past who depicted the time as a dark age. A dark and lawless time when there was no king in the land and chaos reigned. The numerous mentions of how those of lower status are now behaving as nobility reflects a nostalgia for a time when social class was more strictly adhered to, a time much more to the writer's liking.
The words of a snob.
The line,
Every dead person is as a well-born man,
refers to how people of lower status are now able to afford the kinds of tombs only the wealthy and nobility once could.
One doesn't want to be buried for eternity next to someone of a lower class.
Further, the scribe laments the poor quality of goods in Egypt during this time when compared to the Old Kingdom, complaining,
materials for every kind of craft have come to an end.
which has been interpreted by modern-day scholars as referring to the mass production of goods for mass consumption at a time of collapse and cultural degeneration.
Maybe they were in short supply because most of the craftsmen had died from the plague.
The Ipuwer Papyrus also mentions how there is,
No man of yesterday,
and,
that has perished which yesterday was seen.
lamenting the past and the way life once was. However, it is now thought that these texts, written at least 50 years after the reunification of Egypt, are the expressed anxieties of the people of the subsequent Middle Kingdom, in which the author is simply lamenting a change in the social structure of which he does not approve.
Poor may have become men of wealth. He who could not afford sandals owns riches. The robber owns riches, the noble is a thief gold, lapis lazuli, silver, and turquoise, cornelian, amethyst aristrano the necks of female slaves, while noble women roam the land.
Thus deliberately painting a pessimistic picture of the earlier times in order to contrast it with the successes of the Middle Kingdom.
It is tempting to link the Ipuwer Papyrus to the First Intermediate Period, but there's actually no reason for that.
The perception of the First Intermediate Period should not be seen as a dark age or an age of chaos, for, although the country lacked the unity it had maintained since the time of Narmer, Egypt, in the First Intermediate Period, was far from the frenzied chaos traditionally assigned to it by later writers. Individual nomes became richer, more people could afford to purchase goods and services which had earlier been available only to the wealthy. And those who previously could not afford elaborate homes, gardens, and tombs now found that they could, because wealth was no longer only in the hands of the upper-class nobility. Similarly, whereas once only the king was provided with tomb inscriptions in the form of the pyramid texts, now nobility, officials, and ordinary people could afford tomb inscriptions, or their own pyramid texts to guide them through the afterlife. A guidebook to the underworld through the coffin texts.
It's also possible that the gnomes potentially became more isolated from one another and needed to become more self-sufficient. More on that later.
Narratives lamenting a time gone by, wishing for the good old days, and complaining about the present state of one's life exist in every culture from ancient times to the present day, and the Ipuwer Papyrus is but one of many. It has nothing to do with the First Intermediate Period, and there are plenty of scholars who now agree.
Or maybe the Ipuwer Papyrus was more of an historical account of the effects of the 4.2 Kiloyear event. Either way, it doesn't help our journey when it seems even the reasonably contemporary records may be works of fiction. Just goes to show, you can't always believe what you read.
Despite all the advances, during the estimated 194-year First Intermediate Period, apart from 3 proposed possible pyramids, the Pyramid of Ibi, Kua's complex, that is probably a pyramid, and Lepsius Pyramid number 29, their headless pyramid. There were no great buildings erected. In fact, the quarrying of stone seems to have ceased, and the statues placed in tombs were made of wood.
For starters, there are no definite dates for the first intermediate period, nor to where it starts, nor to where it stops. Further, there's some question about at least one of those pyramids, as it may or may not even date to the first intermediate period. But we'll check them out later in the episode.
It has been suggested that most of the pyramids located at Memphis were opened during this period, the lids of their sarcophagi smashed or slid aside, and the royal corpses taken out and stripped.
And given all the wars, pillaging, and the changing of the bloodlines, that would at first seem highly plausible. But it relies on two assumptions. Firstly, you have to assume there were kings entombed within them. And second, to break through the portcullises, you had to have the technology and the support of the priests to break through and into the royal tombs, assuming there actually were bodies interred within them. But remember, this was a time of famine, and desperate times call for desperate measures.
In addition, during the first intermediate period, pottery forms changed, as the elegant ovared pots of the earlier Old Kingdom, broader at the top than the bottom, were replaced by a more bag-shaped pot, wider at the bottom than at the top, which were easier to make, but less elegant.
Perhaps the changes were out of necessity to protect the contents.
Stone vessels became more prominent, and amulets made up of gemstones and crude wooden figures began to make their appearance. Masks were invented, made of linen and gypsum painted with a face, and used to cover the face of a mummy. Reliefs from the pre-unification Theban style of art primarily consist of either high-raised relief or deep-sunk relief with incised details, the figures depicted having narrow shoulders and a high small of the back, with rounded limbs and a lack of musculature in males, the males with pronounced, angular breasts portrayed with rolls of fat, as well as females with angular or pointed breasts are seen in the collection of limestone reliefs of High Official Jet-G. The limestone relief of High Official Jet-G contains 14 horizontal lines of text at the top of the relief, with an account of Jet-G's life, 5 vertical columns on the right dictating an elaborate offering formula particular to the first intermediate period, whilst on the left Jet-G, depicted as a mature official with a pronounced breast, rolls of fat on his torso, and a calf-length kilt, faces right with 2 smaller, more youthful males, that a most likely official staff, wearing shorter kilts, symbolizing that they are less mature and active. Strong facial features and the round modelling of limbs is also seen in statues, as seen in the limestone statue of the Steward Mary from the 11th Dynasty. At the end of the Old Kingdom and the beginning of the first intermediate period, the number of cemeteries increases, suggesting that the population also increased. In addition, the individual tombs become bigger and with more funerary goods, and the number of tombs in each cemetery increases.
No, that doesn't necessarily mean the population was increasing. It could be because more people were dying. As the evidence on Elephantine Island in episode 11 showed us, and back in episode 7, there were lower levels of the Nile, possibly the result of a drought caused by the 4.2 Kiloyear event, and therefore a period of famine and possibly plague. And while the king's lists are important, they may not necessarily help us with reconstructing the order of lineage through the first intermediate period. As for the 7th dynasty, I'm sure the alternate gnome rulers existed, but you can't paint a pony black and white and then try to pass it off as a zebra. I don't think they qualify as a dynasty per se. more as a collective distraction from the true dynasty bloodlines, those recorded in the Abydos Kings list and by Manetho in the 8th dynasty. But let us dissect the evidence we do have.
The correct chronology of this turbulent time is far from easy as, unfortunately, neither the 7th nor 8th dynasties were particularly successful, and, as they left behind very little textual or architectural evidence, hardly anything is actually known about them.
Including who ruled when, who followed who, and how long they ruled. Infighting and family quarrels will tend to do all that. So it's a bit like trying to put a jigsaw puzzle together, possibly with numerous key pieces missing and others thrown in to plug the gap, not knowing what the final image is, then trying to make some sense of it all. But we'll give it a go, starting from the most accepted version of the dynasties. But even before we start doing that, there are problems.
The Saqqara kings list ends, as expected, with Pepi II of the 6th dynasty, but then it ignores the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th dynasties completely and jumps straight to the middle of the 11th dynasty to Mentuhotep II and the Middle Kingdom, as though there had never been any break in power.
And that may have been the case. The self-proclaimed kings of the other regions of Egypt not recognized by the scribes of the Saqqara kings list.
As for the Karnak list, once carved on Karnak Temple in Thebes, it has 61 kings listed up to the time of the pharaoh Thutmose III, but tells us nothing about the first intermediate period.
Clearly, the gaps and discrepancies between the various kings lists is indicative of their support of their specific political agendas. But is there any actual physical evidence to support that?
One thing that is known, according to the Egyptian priest Manetho, writing in Egyptologists in the 3rd century BC, 1800 years after the period, who had access to temple records and could read the hieroglyphs, is that the kings of both dynasties continued to rule from Memphis.
Although in reality, they only had control over the local population. The remainder of the various nomes of Egypt were basically self-governing.
That said, Manetho's writings have not survived to this day and are only known to us via 2 later writers, Sextus Julius Africanus, writing sometime between 200 BC and 192 BC, and Eusebius of Caesarea, around 500 years after Africanus, both of whom quoted from Manetho's Egyptologists. Unfortunately, these 2 sources often contradicted each other and are now also lost.
Brilliant. The pickings are scarce at best, and potentially flawed. And all that means, as we shall see, the kings of the 7th and 8th dynasties and their dates thus have no lasting nor reliable status in Egyptian history. Nevertheless, we have to examine what evidence we do have of their existence and go from there.
From the city of Memphis, the former home of the 6th dynasty pharaohs, 2 successive but separate dynasties emerged, each of which tried to consolidate power.
That's actually not fact. It's speculation.
The ancient Egyptians didn't classify the pharaohs into dynasties at all. That was first done by Herodotus, a Greek, writing in the 5th century BC, around 1,600 years after the first intermediate period.
Why did he divide the history into dynasties? What was his criteria? What did he know that we haven't figured out yet?
This is most likely where Manetho, writing 200 years later, got his information.
Or where Manetho misinterpreted the information.
The 7th dynasty seems to have been comprised of government officials who had served under Pepi II during the Old Kingdom, who, given the vacant throne, were now trying to usurp power and create kingdoms of their own in their own regions. At the same time, the 8th dynasty pharaohs, who claimed to be the direct descendants of the 6th dynasty pharaohs, also ruled from Memphis. Although their reigns seem to have been short and frequently disrupted, the rapid succession of brief reigns at the time suggesting times of hardship or conflict.
Given the nepotism that was rife, to me, it seems more likely that the 7th dynasty rulers were indirectly related to Pepi II, most likely first or second cousins, and so ruled from their surrounding nomes, with the 8th dynasty rulers, those of the direct 6th dynasty lineage, confined to Memphis itself, and the interruptions to their rule being attributable to the increased wealth, status, and confrontational actions of the 7th dynasty interlopers. But we shall have to find out.
The 7th dynasty would normally mark the beginning of the first intermediate period. However, as the ancient Egyptians didn't classify the lineage in dynasties, and as the only actual historical account of the 7th dynasty was in Manetho's Egyptologists, next to nothing is known of this dynasty beyond Manetho's account, and the original text is lost.
Well, that's a good start. Not.
Africanus wrote that 70 kings ruled in Memphis for 70 days, whilst Eusebius, writing more than 500 years later, held that the 7th dynasty
of only 5 kings who ruled for 75 days.
However, 70 kings in 70 days is usually considered the correct version of Manetho concerning the 7th dynasty.
That doesn't make sense to me. Whether it was 70 kings or 5 kings, it seems that over the course of 70 to 75 days following the death of Pepi II, there was a complete bun fight for the throne, where an oligarchy comprising powerful officials of the 6th dynasty based in Memphis attempted to seize control of the country. But what if Manetho was wrong? Or isn't it possible Africanus could simply have misread Manetho? Or that he translated it incorrectly? I mean, an average of a new king every day for a period of 2.5 months? The mechanics of it are incredulous. Was it a plague? Assassinations? A production line of burials? Coronations? All caused by a massive family feud? A war? In either case, kings must have been dropping like flies. Or was the error it wasn't 70 days, it was 70 years? A typo, as we might call it. And why did Eusebius, 500 years later, amend the number of kings? Isn't it more likely the time frame was correct, but Eusebius had other knowledge, correcting the errors of Africanus? Of course, another possibility is that there could have been any number of simultaneous rulers. For example, the capital may well have been Memphis, in the north, and there were several people in the north claiming to be kings. But it is also more than likely that further up the Nile, given the various nomarchs ruling further up the Nile, that there were numerous other rulers to the south saying they were kings of their nomes.
The 7th dynasty thus may have been an oligarchy, comprising powerful officials of the 6th dynasty, based in Memphis, who attempted to claim control of the country. However, most Egyptologists usually consider the poorly known and short-lived rapid succession of the 7th dynasty pharaohs to be fictitious, and thus either ignore it altogether or combined it with the 8th dynasty.
And given Manetho's propensity to misinterpret, exaggerate, or fabricate, I tend to agree. The existence of the 7th dynasty may have simply been an oligarchy, or a series of oligarchies, comprising powerful Memphis-based officials of the 6th dynasty, each of whom attempted to take control of the country through their nome. And if they were blood-related, or if they were far distant relatives of the acknowledged lineage of the gods, then that might well explain Manetho's comment of 70 kings in 70 days, as, the true royal lineage disrupted, the regional throne would have been up for grabs. It may also explain why there is no record of them ruling, as the priests and scribes, being the only literate officials, based on their bloodlines not being directly aligned with the gods, probably didn't acknowledge the usurper's claim to the throne, and saw their claim as illegitimate. Either that, or they were all dead from the plague.
However many kings there actually were, it is clear that, during this time period, a breakdown of the central authority of Egypt was underway. The rulers of these alternate and peripheral dynasties were based in and around Memphis and up the Nile, and seem to have relied on the power of the nomarch Cirques of Coptos, on whom they bestowed titles and honours. At the end of the day, there is no record of these 7th dynasty rulers, the only actual evidence being the Abydos Kings List, one of the best sources for studying the kings, carved on the wall of the Hall of the Ancients, in the temple of Seti I at Abydos, the sacred city where Osiris was buried during the early Ramesside period of Seti I, and where the early kings of the 1st and 2nd dynasties had their burials.
And we shall examine Seti's temple in much greater detail when we get to Abydos later in the series. But for now, let's examine the list.
The Abydos Kings list records a list of kings from Narmer to Seti I, and includes 8 rulers for Dynasty 7 and 9 rulers for Dynasty 8, before it jumps to what we now know as the 11th dynasty at the end of the 1st intermediate period and the beginning of the Middle Kingdom, failing to recognize the 9th and 10th dynasty rulers in Heracleopolis and the rulers in Thebes, who coexisted with rulers in Memphis. Instead, projecting the idea that power moved seamlessly from Memphis to Thebes with the rule of Mentuhotep II.
Actually, that's not quite right, because as we know, the ancient Egyptians didn't classify the pharaohs into dynasties at all. That was first done by Herodotus in the 5th century BC, which is most likely where Manetho got his information.
Meanwhile, the Turin Kings list, copied from an earlier source during the reign of Ramses II, which was itself riddled with lacunae and must have been in a poor state, is patchy, with many damaged entries, appears to list 24 rulers from Dynasty 7 to Dynasty 11, including all of the Theban rulers and the rulers of Heracleopolis, who the Thebans defeated to seize power, but cuts out some of the Memphite rulers.
Meaning any date in the range of 2500 to 2000 BC, 2400 to 2100 BC, for example, could actually be expressing a similar date of around 2200 BC, plus or minus the range of error. Compounding all of that is there's not much physical evidence to examine.
The only artifacts found attributable to the 7th dynasty include a few scarabs that have been attributed to King Neferkare II, although many Egyptologists have argued that the 7th dynasty is fictitious, and that Neferkare II is part of the 8th dynasty.
And I agree. And for that reason, I'm going to roll the 7th dynasty into the 8th dynasty. The bottom line, just because anything is written down anywhere at any time doesn't mean it's a factual account of history. It's a subjective perspective.
According to the Turin Papyrus, the number of 8th dynasty's rulers is estimated as 13 kings. But, because this papyrus was badly damaged, we lost most of their names and little is known about this dynasty, as very little textual or architectural evidence survives.
It's like a blind man looking for a painting on the wall of a dark room.
Ruling from Memphis, the A dynasty pharaohs claimed to be the direct descendants of the 6th dynasty pharaohs, and, although their reign seemed to have been short and frequently disrupted, the Memphite kings, although weak in power, held on to the Memphite artistic traditions that had been in place throughout the Old Kingdom. In this way, The weakened Memphite state symbolically held on to the vestiges of glory in which the Old Kingdom had revealed through collections such as the limestone reliefs of High Official Chetji. Again, supposedly citing Manetho's Egyptologists, Africanus claims that the 8th dynasty consisted of 27 kings who reigned for 146 years, although it is now widely agreed that Manetho's estimate for its duration is a very substantial overestimation of the reality. Eusebius, on the other hand, records that the 8th dynasty includes 5 kings who ruled for 100 years, both claiming all of the kings ruled from Memphis and claim to be the direct descendants of the 6th dynasty kings.
Which is not exactly consistent evidence, because any theories as to who they married or how they were related is purely speculative.
Given that 5 of the 8th dynasty kings bear Pepi II's throne name of Neferkare as part of their own names, it is highly likely they are descendants of the long-lived 6th dynasty king, no doubt trying to hold on to the reins of power through the power of association.
But whether they are sons, grandsons, nephews, or third cousins twice removed is anyone's guess, though a long reign leans towards him having many sons. Thankfully, unlike the 7th dynasty, we have more evidence.
2 historical sources, both dating to the New Kingdom, list kings belonging to the 8th dynasty. The earliest of the 2, thus the main historical source on the 8th dynasty, is the Abydos king list, written during the reign of Seti I. The list includes 17 names for this period, entries 40 to 56, placed between the end of the 6th dynasty of the Old Kingdom period and the beginning of the 11th dynasty of the Middle Kingdom.
Although, in comparison to other lists, several kings are only attested once, and their position is unknown.
Furthermore, the names of these kings are different from those known from the 9th and 10th dynasties, none of which are on the Abydos list. As a consequence, entries 40 to 56 of the Abydos list are assigned to the 7th and 8th dynasties. The other New Kingdom source on the 8th dynasty is the Turin Canon, written during the reign of Ramses II and copied from an earlier source. Though heavily damaged, riddled with lacunae, and extremely difficult to read, the lacunae provide room for 2 or 3 more kings before the end of the dynasty, which indicates that the missing parts probably contain the kings in the 51st to 55th registers of the Abydos king list, the 3 names, Netjer-Kare-Sipter, another hard-to-read name, and finally, that of Quarkare-Ibi, the 53rd king, appearing on papyrus fragments which might be allocated to the 8th dynasty kings on the Abydos king list.
It literally is a brain-teasing jigsaw puzzle.
The main archaeological evidence for kings of the 8th dynasty comes from the fragments of 2 royal decrees, dating to the reign of Neferkauhor, discovered in Coptos, which names some of the last pharaohs of the dynasty, while tentative evidence for the early kings of the dynasty comes from tombs in Saqqara, in particular the pyramid of Quarkare-Ibi. Beyond that, there are also royal inscriptions found in Wadi Hammamet and in Upper Egypt, as well as non-royal inscriptions from Upper Egypt.
Let's have a look at who most likely comprised the 8th dynasty.
According to the 41st entry of the Abydos Kings list, Menkaure, the son of Netjer-Kare-Sipter, the last ruler of the 6th dynasty, was the first listed pharaoh of the 8th dynasty, and, according to Manetho, Menkaure's seat of power was in Memphis. Menkaure is possibly attested by a relief from the tomb of Queen Neith, another possible, though not contemporaneous attestation, being a cylinder seal, now in the British Museum, inscribed with the text, "The Good God, Lord of the Two Lands, Menkaure," although that seal dates to the 26th dynasty, some 1,700 years after Menkaure's lifetime, and, given that Menkaure is a rather obscure king. The attribution of the seal to Menkaure is unlikely, some scholars suggesting instead that the seal bears a mistake and actually refers to the better-known pharaoh Menkaure, the supposed builder of the third pyramid of Giza.
An issue we addressed in episode 9 when we looked at Khufu, the supposed builder of the Great Pyramid.
Menkaure supposedly died in the year 2181 BC.
And that's where it all gets very interesting. Because, according to the Egyptologists, the next 9 kings all died in the same year, 2181 BC. So what happened? Clearly they didn't all die on the same day. It wasn't an earthquake or a battle. It was sequential, and that leaves 2 possibilities. One, that they were all sequentially and systematically assassinated, picked off by someone way down the lineage, which is highly unlikely. Or 2, something like a famine or a plague swept over Egypt.
Possibly Menkaure's son, brother, or uncle, Neferkare II, though he ruled from Memphis, is only attested through his name on the 42nd entry of the Abydos king list.
It's not a good start.
Neferkare II has been tentatively identified by one Egyptologist with the prenomen Wadje Kare. A flourishing is the Kar of Ra, as is attested on graffiti from Wadi Hammamet, but that prenomen is rejected by others who claim there is no mention of any attestation for Neferkare II beyond the Abydos king list, while others relate the name Wadje Kare to either Neferkare III or Neferkare II.
And it's all speculation.
The Turin canon has a large lacuna at this spot, affecting many kings of the 8th dynasty, and thus the duration of Neferkare II's reign, which would have been reported on the document, is lost.
It's just a dog's breakfast.
A few scarabs have been found and attributed to Neferkare II, who reigned for a very short period of time, dying in the same year as his predecessor.
It's possible he met foul play and was assassinated, but if there was a famine, the last person to die from it would be the pharaoh. So I'm convinced something else was afoot. I think Neferkare II must have died from a plague.
Neferkare III, Nebi, possibly the son of Neferkare II, was the next king in the Abydos king list, his name clearly readable, and, unlike most kings of this period, he is also attested by a further 2 contemporary sources on the false door of the tomb of Anchisenpepi II, and also inscribed on her sarcophagus. These attestations showing that Neferkare Nebi's mother was most likely the 6th dynasty queen, Anchisenpepi II, which would presumably make his father, the 6th dynasty pharaoh Merenre Nemtiemsaf I. The Stellar of Anchisenpepi II records that Neferkare Nebi began the construction of a pyramid, possibly at Saqqara, named Jedank Neferkare Nebi, meaning Neferkare Nebi is enduring of life, but the location of the pyramid is unknown and it most probably never significantly entered the building stage.
Or there was no building, and the stela simply records either the excavation of a pre-existing structure or the repairing of one of the damaged pyramids at Saqqara.
Like many kings of the 8th dynasty, Neferkare Nebi is absent from the Turin canon as a large lacuna affects the location where his name would have been listed. Like his predecessor, Neferkare III reigned for a very short period, also dying in 2181 BC.
Another assassination? Unlikely. Most likely from a plague that befell Egypt.
Djedkare Shemmai, possibly also known as Djedkar Mare, was most likely the next pharaoh of the 8th dynasty, as his name is attested on the Abydos king list. However, no other contemporary document or building with his name has ever been found. He too died shortly after assuming the throne in 2181 BC.
Okay, I think we can definitely rule out assassination now. No doubt, he also died from the plague.
Neferkare Kendu, also Neferkare IV, possibly Neferkar-Kendere, is number 45 on the Abydos king list. However, due to the large lacuna that affects most kings of the 7th, 8th dynasty, he is absent from the Turin canon, and there are no further attestation firmly attributable to him. Neferkare Kendu reigned for a very short period of time, dying in the same year as his 4 previous predecessors.
The plague strikes again. But what sort of plague? How is it that they did not know what was killing them?
Merenhor is the next king listed in the 8th dynasty, his name present in position 46 on the Abydos king list. Other than that, nothing else is known of him other than, like his 5 predecessors, Merenhor reigned for a very short period, also dying in 2181 BC.
Clearly the plague had not just infiltrated the royal family, but it was somehow specifically targeting the pharaohs, perhaps even sequentially.
Neferkarmen was most likely the next pharaoh of the 8th dynasty. His throne name Sneferkar attested on the Abydos king list at position 47. Although it is possible that here the S of the name is mistakenly created and should be Min, hence Neferkarmen. The correct reading of this king's name is provided, along with the name of Nikkare, on a gold plaque now in the British Museum. However, it has been suggested that this object could be a modern forgery.
A forgery in gold. Isn't it more likely that Nikkare was the son of Neferkarmen, especially as his name appears next on the Abydos kings list?
Shortly after assuming the throne in 2181 BC, Neferkarmen also died.
Yet another victim of the plague.
Nikkare, also Nikkare I, is only known for certain thanks to the Abydos king list, his name appearing as the 48th entry. It's possible his name was also mentioned on the Turin canon, but his name and the duration of his reign are lost due to the large lacuna affecting kings 2 through 11 of the 8th dynasty. The only other possible contemporary attestation of this king being a single faience cylinder seal, which may bear Nikkare's name. Nikkare reigned for a very short period of time, dying in 2181 BC, the same year as his 7 previous predecessors.
The plague strikes again.
Neferkare Tereru, also Neferkare V, the next pharaoh, is only attested on the Abydos king list at position 49, the lacuna on the Turin canon also affecting him. Like his 8 predecessors, Neferkare Tereru reigned for a very short period, also dying in 2181 BC.
And yet another victim of the plague.
Possibly the 10th pharaoh of the 8th dynasty, Neferkarhor is attested on the Abydos king list at position 50, and also on a black steatite cylinder seal of unknown provenance, although his name is absent from the Turin king list due to the large lacuna affecting the 7th, 8th dynasty. Neferkarhor also had a brief reign, dying in 2181 BC.
9 deaths in 1 year, although it seems that he was the last to die from the plague. But a plague of what?
Plague is a serious infectious bacterial disease caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, a member of the family Yersineaceae. Yersinia pestis circulates in animal reservoirs, particularly in rodents, found on all continents in a broad belt in the tropical and subtropical latitudes and the warmer parts of the temperate latitudes around the globe, between the parallels 55 degrees north and 40 degrees south, except for Australia. Transmission of Yersinia pestis to an uninfected individual is possible by any of the following means: droplet contact, coughing or sneezing on another person; direct physical contact, touching an infected person, including sexual contact; indirect contact, usually by touching soil contamination or a contaminated surface; airborne transmission, if the microorganism can remain in the air for long periods; fecal-oral transmission, usually from contaminated food or water sources; vector-borne transmission, carried by insects or other animals. There are 3 forms of plague, each of which affects a different part of the body and has associated symptoms.
Contrary to popular beliefs, rats did not directly start the bubonic plague.
Bubonic plagues, such as the infamous Black Death of 1348 in the Middle Ages that killed 50 million people in Europe alone, are generally spread by flea bites from infected rodents, rats, squirrels, etc. It is primarily a disease in the oriental rat fleas, Xenopsilla chiopis, that infested the rats, that are the primary cause of the transmission of Yersinia pestis,
making the rats themselves the first victims of the plague.
Rodent-borne infection in a human occurs when a person is bitten by a flea that has been infected by biting a rodent that itself has been infected by the bite of a flea carrying the disease. The bacteria multiply inside the flea, sticking together to form a plug that blocks its stomach and causes it to starve. The flea then bites a host and continues to feed, even though it cannot quell its hunger, and consequently, the flea regurgitates blood contaminated with the bacteria back into the bite wound, infecting a new person with the Yersinia pestis bacterium.
The flea eventually dying from starvation.
The plague-causing bacterium are then passed into the tissue and reproduce inside the cells, secreting several toxins, often causing the bite itself to become ulcerated. Once in the body, the bacterium can also enter the lymphatic system, which drains interstitial fluid, the watery fluid filling the spaces between blood vessels and cells, the bacterium spreading through the lymphatic vessels until it reaches a lymph node, where it causes acute lymphadenitis, the inflammation and swelling of lymph nodes, usually caused from the infection that the immune system is fighting. The swollen lymph nodes forming the characteristic buboes associated with the disease. The term buboes from the Greek word bubo for groin, swollen gland. Autopsies of these buboes reveal these buboes to be mostly hemorrhagic, relating to excessive bleeding from a ruptured blood vessel, or necrotic, where tissue is dead or dying, caused by the infection, toxins, or a lack of blood flow. Lymphatics ultimately drain into the bloodstream, so if the lymph node is overwhelmed, the plague bacteria can pass into the bloodstream and travel to almost any part of the body, causing the second type of plague, septicemic plague, in which the bacterial endotoxins cause disseminated intravascular coagulation, creating tiny clots throughout the body and possibly ischemic necrosis, in which tissues die due to a lack of blood circulation. DIC results in depletion of the body's clotting resources so that it can no longer control bleeding. Consequently, there is bleeding into the skin and other organs, which can cause a red or black patchy rash, and coughing up and vomiting of blood. There are bumps on the skin that look somewhat like insect bites. These are usually red and sometimes white in the center. Untreated, the septicemic plague is usually fatal. Septicemic plagues can also be caused by direct contact or handling of an infected animal, leading to inhaling infected respiratory droplets, and they infect the blood, causing tissues to turn black and die.
If the lungs are infected, it can cause the third type of plague, the pneumonic plague.
Pneumonic plague arises from infection of the lungs, causing shortness of breath, chest pain, spitting or vomiting blood, and coughing that produces airborne infectious droplets containing bacterial cells which are generally spread through the air between people and are likely to infect anyone inhaling them. The incubation period for pneumonic plague is usually 2 to 4 days, although sometimes it can be as short as a few hours. The course of pneumonic plague is rapid and, if it remains untreated, may result in hemoptysis or hemoptysis, the discharge of blood or blood-stained mucus through the mouth coming from the bronchi, larynx, trachea, or lungs. However, rather than blood loss, the primary danger comes from choking, with an inevitable mortality rate of nearly 100% in 1 to 6 days.
You literally drown in your own blood. But plagues can also fall into 2 categories.
Historical plagues, like the Black Death of 1348 and the Plague of Justinian, a major pandemic in the 6th to 7th centuries, carried by rats ou fleas from grain shipments that arrived in Egypt's port of Pelusium around 541 AD, each rely upon acts of nature.
While the second, the biblical plagues, like the 10 plagues listed in the book of Exodus from the Bible, rely on acts of God. So what sort of plagues are we talking about in ancient Egypt, which was up to 3,000 years before the Bible, as we now know it, first existed? In particular, one plague during the 8th dynasty in or around 2181 BC.
Plagues in ancient Egypt refer primarily to the 10 plagues of Exodus from the Bible, a series of divine calamities: blood, frogs, lice, flies, livestock pestilence, boils, hail, locusts, darkness, death of firstborn, sent to persuade Pharaoh to free the Israelites, often interpreted as natural phenomena, algal blooms, insect swarms, or symbolic judgments against Egyptian gods.
We'll look at all of that in much greater detail in a future episode when we examine the end of the 17th dynasty. But is there any physical difference between the 10 biblical plagues of Exodus and actual historical plagues? Of course there is, or else I wouldn't have asked the question.
The prolonged hot weather and high temperatures associated with droughts causes sources of water to dry up and the proliferation of Pfisteria, an algae that makes the water toxic and fish to become diseased.
All easily attributable to the 4.2 Kiloyear event. Add to that a drought and famine, and the people would have relied on the stores of grain to survive, and priority would naturally have gone to the pharaoh.
With no fish or toads to eat the locust larvae, locust plagues would have ensued, with the crops and grains contaminated with locust feces that contain mycotoxins such as Stachybotrys atro that, in turn, would have released fungal spores, which, once inhaled, would have caused death within hours due to internal bleeding in the lungs and intestines.
So why didn't everyone die?
The fungal spores would have only affected the top layer in the grain store, and, since the people who entered the granaries first, and are those who ate first, would have been the socially most powerful, they would have inhaled the airborne mycotoxins released by the fungi, or been the first to be poisoned directly by eating.
And since the pharaoh was considered the most important, they were given an extra helping of the best food and consequently a lethal dose of the toxins, which might explain why the plague went through the royal family sequentially, like a dose of Epsom salts.
It would have been the same with the priests and scribes. The ones who write the history would have been the most devastated, which might explain the lack of records as they were dying before they could document anything, or too busy simply trying to survive.
In a bizarre reverse twist of the survival of the privileged few, it would have had the opposite effect and killed them. But survive? Somehow they did.
The name Neferkare VI, Pepi-Seneb, is attested on the Abydos king list at position 51, but nowhere else, although it has been proposed that Neferkare Pepi-Seneb is to be identified with a Neferkare Ki-Red Seneb who appears on the Turin canon immediately following the large lacunar, the epithet Kurd meaning child or young. Consequently, Neferkare Ki-Red Seneb translating as Neferkare the child is healthy. Several hypotheses have been put forth by Egyptologists concerning this epithet. One, that the king was called Ki-Red on the Turin canon because of his youthful age upon ascending to the throne. The second, that it was because he had the same name as his father, Neferkare II.
Or simply because he survived the plague into his teens.
According to the most recent reading and interpretation of the Turin canon, Neferkare VI, Pepi-Seneb, died in 2171 BC.
Meaning he must have reigned about 10 years.
Even though it is reported at entry 52 of the Abydos king list as Neferkar Arnu, it is considered the S of the name is mistakenly created and should be Min, hence Neferkar Min Arnu. This attestation, and a complementary one in the Turin canon, have most Egyptologists agreeing that Neferkar Min Arnu, who reigned over the Memphite region, was the next king of the 8th dynasty, despite the fact any further details about Neferkar Min Arnu's reign are lost in the lacunar of the Turin canon. The Abydos king list names his successor as Quarkare Eb. Attested on the 53rd entry of the Abydos king list, and possibly on the Turin canon, Quarkare Eb is one of the best attested pharaohs of the 8th dynasty, partly due to the discovery by Carl Richard Lepsius in the 19th century of his small pyramid in South Saqqara, listed as number 40 in Lepsius's pioneering list of pyramids because of its location.
Not if it's been incorrectly ascribed to Ebi, it's not. The question is, from our examination of the pyramids in episodes 9, 10 and 11, was it really Quarkare Ebi's pyramid?
Northeast of Shepseskaf's tomb, and near to the causeway of the pyramid of Pepi II, the pyramid of Quarkare Eb was not only the last pyramid built in Saqqara, it was the first and only one that is definitely dated to the first intermediate period.
Sorry, I don't buy any of that. Yes, there may have been a plague. Yes, there may have been hard times. But that's not evidence either way for there only being one pyramid built. That's assuming there was one built at all. Let's see what the actual evidence from the pyramid reveals.
Oriented on a northwest or southeast axis, the pyramid is very similar in plan, dimensions, and decorations to the 6th dynasty pyramids of the queens of Pepi II, the last great pharaoh of the Old Kingdom. Hence it was originally proposed that the pyramid belonged to Ankhesen's Pepi IV, one of Pepi II's wives, and was only later appropriated by Eb,
thus giving a perfect example of just how easily not only can errors be made, but how they can be passed on to future archaeologists. That they're similar is one thing, but that doesn't mean that any one of them were built during dynastic times.
Measuring 31.5 metres at the base and 21 metres high, with a slope of just over 53 degrees at the time of its construction, today the monument is just a 3-metre-high heap of mud and limestone chips in the sands of Saqqara. Its poor state of repair is not attributable to natural causes, but rather to the actions of stone thieves.
Oh, here we go again. Those mysterious and mischievous stone thieves. Surely it's possible a massive tsunami could have caused at least some of the damage.
Very little of the internal layout of the pyramid was known until it was excavated from 1929 until 1931 by Gustav Kiloyear. The core of the pyramid was built with limestone blocks of local origin, most of which are now gone, probably reused in later constructions. However, some of those remaining blocks are crudely inscribed in red, with the title, Chief of the Libyans, the meaning of which is unclear.
Limestone blocks marked with Chief of the Libyans. Now, I'm sure they weren't the actual words, that would have been a translation. But one thing is certain, the blocks weren't there by accident. Maybe the Libyan slaves were being used to repair the structure.
Historical and archaeological records from the Egyptian Delta, including the Palermo stone, show that various Libyan tribes, the tribal Berbers, inhabited and ruled from Sudan to Fezzan, the southwestern region of modern Libya, and across the Egyptian Delta long before the forced unification of Egypt by Narmer around 3300 BC.
Whilst they were most likely and ultimately suppressed by Narmer and the dynastic Egyptians, it is highly unlikely they disappeared. And with the breakdown of the dynastic rule at the end of the 6th dynasty, the tribal Berbers may well have attempted a reclamation of power in certain nomes. Part of this may have been the rebuilding of the damaged Quaqqa-Ibi pyramid, a pyramid that had still to be reclaimed at the beginning of the first intermediate period. However, by the time of Quaqqa-Ibi, that tribal challenge had been suppressed, and Quaqqa-Ibi reclaimed the pyramid, adding the pyramid text to the walls of the subterranean chambers.
It seems that even though the foundations for the outer casing of the pyramid were laid, the casing itself was never mounted.
Who knows? Maybe they were. And along with the subsequent external damage to the structure, were most likely washed away at the end of the 17th dynasty, which we will get to in an upcoming episode.
Like other pyramids of the period, on the north side of the pyramid, Kiloyear found an 8-metre-long limestone-clad descending corridor, leading down with an inclination of 25 degrees to a large granite portcullis.
And there we have it, a granite portcullis. Exactly the same design as the supposed 6th dynasty pyramids we examined in the last episode, which tells me that the internal structure is much older than the 8th dynasty.
Behind this portcullis, to the east, lay a serdab for the statue of the car of the deceased, and, to the west, the king's burial chamber, both the corridor and the walls of the burial chamber, seemingly inscribed for EB rather than appropriated by him, with the last known instance of the pyramid texts.
That's the evidence relied upon to attribute the pyramid to Quaqqa-Ibi. That's the evidence that makes Quaqqa-Ibi the only 8th dynasty king who can be connected to any monumental construction, despite the fact the possibility of the text being re-inscribed cannot be ruled out. That's the sort of logic that spins my head. If it's Ibi's pyramid, then surely the text would be for him. Are they suggesting they were originally for Uncas and Pepi IV and rescribed? Why? the text could have been added any time after the structure was created. And given the evidence we've seen in episodes 9, 10 and 11, most likely were. So it's not evidence, it's speculation.
Jequier judged the quality of the inscriptions as very average. Furthermore, the placement of the spells appears relatively indiscriminate.
Indications of poor technical skills, and that perhaps the texts were rushed.
On the west side of the burial chamber is a false door and a huge granite block on which once stood the sarcophagus of the king.
More granite. I think that seals the deal. The massive granite convinces me this structure was not created by Quakare Ibi. One only has to compare the technical skills required to quarry, craft, and transport a huge granite block to the level of competence reflected in the pyramid texts to clearly see that they are civilizations apart. And where is the sarcophagus, if there was one? I think, like his predecessors in the 6th dynasty, Quakare Ibi usurped this structure, adding the pyramid texts and decorations to the subterranean room with the view to making it his burial chamber.
The burial chamber ceiling was flat, decorated with stars, and was probably made of a single 5-meter long block of Tura limestone, now missing.
If it's missing, how do they know it was made of limestone? How do they know it was flat? It could just as easily have been a gabled ceiling like so many others. How do they know it was one piece 5 meters long? They don't. They're speculating. And poorly, I might add.
Today, a large block of concrete protects the chamber.
So, what happened to all the stone of the original ceiling? Clearly, the old ceiling had collapsed. But was it flat? Or was it a gabled ceiling? And what caused this massive block or blocks of Tura limestone to fracture and collapse? And was the ceiling there before or after the texts were added? Surely those who replaced it with concrete know what was there before. After all, wouldn't they have had to remove it? So why the secrecy?
Adjacent to the east side of the pyramid is a small mud brick chapel that served as temple for the cult of the dead king.
A mud brick chapel, not a limestone one. What I would suggest is a true reflection of the technical skills of the 8th dynasty.
The entrance of the chapel is located on its north side, and inside the temple, immediately against the pyramid wall, is an offering hall where Jequier found a stone wash basin, an alabaster tray, obsidian mortar tools, as well as stele or a false door of which only the foundations remain.
Stone, alabaster, obsidian, a designer's hodgepodge. Any or all of these artifacts could have been added at any time before the chapel was destroyed.
The south part of the chapel is occupied by magazine rooms, where, nearby, Jequier discovered several older tombs from the 6th dynasty.
Although, as we discovered in numerous previous episodes, the presence of the 6th dynasty tombs does not mean you can attribute the pyramids to the same dynasty.
No trace of a causeway nor of a valley temple has been found to this day, and it is likely that there never was any.
Possibly, but what if they were? What if they were washed away by a massive tsunami? Who knows? Perhaps we'll find out more when we explore Saqqara later in the series.
According to the Turan canon, Quakare Ibi only reigned for 2 years, 1 month and 1 day. But although his seat of power was in Memphis, and he was the 14th ruler of the 8th dynasty, he probably did not hold power over all of Egypt.
So it's highly unlikely he built a pyramid. Repaired and usurped one? Possibly. But built one from scratch? in the middle of a drought? I severely doubt it.
Although his name is absent from the Turin canon due to the lacunar, Neferkhaure is named as the 54th entry of the Abydos king list, and is also known from a contemporary inscription, a fragmentary decree, inscribed on a limestone slab known as the Koptos decree. The decree, dated to the 4th regnal year of Neferkhaure, the highest attested date of any king of the 8th dynasty, concerns offerings for the Temple of Min at Koptos, and is addressed to the then governor of Upper Egypt, Shimei, requiring that fixed amounts of offerings be given at regular intervals to the god Min and then possibly to a statue of the king. Although Neferkhaure's seat of power was Memphis, it is unlikely he held power over all of Egypt, and, though the lacunar in the Turin canon obscures his name, the length of his reign is preserved, with 4 years, 2 months. At a time when Egypt was possibly divided between several ruling factions, Neferkhaure Kirwi-Harpi, also known as Quiwihepu Neferkhaure, was the penultimate pharaoh of the 8th dynasty and, as such, would have only ruled over the region of Memphis. Listed on entry 55 of the Abydos king list, Neferkhaure is one of the best attested kings of this period, with a total of 8 different decrees found in the Temple of Min at Koptos attributed to Neferkhaure, and surviving to this day in fragmentary condition. 4 of these decrees, inscribed on limestone slabs, given to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1914 by the philanthropist Edward Harkis. 7 out of the 8 decrees were issued on a single day of the first year of reign of Neferkhaure, the year in question given the name of year of uniting the 2 lands.
So, once again, Egypt was divided.
In the first decree, Neferkhaure bestows titles to his eldest daughter, Nebiut, wife of a vizier named Shimei. He attributes her a bodyguard, the commandant of soldiers, Krotne, and orders the construction of a sacred bark for a god called 2 Powers, perhaps the syncretized god, Horus Min. The second and best preserved of the decrees concerns the appointment of Shimei's son, Ed, to the post of governor of Upper Egypt, ruling over the 7 southernmost nomes from Elephantine to Diospolis Parvar. The third and fourth decrees, partially preserved on a single fragment, record Neferkhaure giving Ed's brother a post in the Temple of Min, with the remaining decrees concerning the appointment of mortuary priests to the chapels of Nebiut and Shimei, as well as ordering inventories at the Temple of Min. Beyond the decrees, Neferkhaure is also attested by 2 inscriptions, dated to the first year of his reign, month for of Shimu, day 2, on a wall in Shimei's tomb. The partly destroyed inscriptions report the bringing of stone from Wadi Hammamet, appearing to mention that the work was done within 19 days. These correlate with 3 rock inscriptions at Wadi Hammamet, reporting the bringing of a stone. Although his name on the Turin canon is lost due to the lacunar, the duration of Neferkhaure's reign is preserved and given as 2 years, 1 month, and 1 day. Neferkhaure, sometimes referred to as Neferkhaure II because of Neferkhaure Kakai, was the final king of the 8th dynasty, and to some, of the Old Kingdom. His name is clearly attested on the 56th entry of the Abydos king list, and on the latest reconstruction of the Turin canon. Neferkhaure II is identified by some Egyptologists with the Horus name Demedjib-Tarwi, he who unifies the heart of the 2 lands, which appears in a royal limestone tablet known as the Koptos Decree R, now in the Egyptian Museum, that concerns exempting the Temple of Min at Koptos from dues and duties, and contains a list of punishments for anyone who dares to damage or plunder a shrine dedicated to the god Min of Koptos. Another proposed identification concerns the prenomen Wadji Kare. Flourishing is the Ka of Rar, mentioned only once in Koptos Decree R, who reigned around 2150 BCE and who is considered to be a very obscure figure in Egyptian history. Because he is not mentioned in any Ramesside king list, Wadji Kare's existence is questioned by some scholars. Some see Wadji Kare as distinct from Deme Jib Tarwi and equate Wadji Kare with an obscure ruler named Horkabor, while others believe that Wadji Kare may have been the prenomen of Neferkare II, who ruled at the beginning of the dynasty, and the same person as Deme Jib Tarwi.
It's all very confusing.
Alternatively, it has been proposed that Wadji Kare is the predecessor of Deme Jib Tarwi and places both rulers chronologically into the 9th dynasty. Finally, both Deme Jib Tarwi and Wadji Kare are not known from any other contemporary attestation than the decree, and, unless they are to be identified with Neferir Kare II or Neferkare II, they are both absent from the Abydos king list and the Turin canon.
It's all speculation.
The Turin canon credits Neferir Kare II with a reign of a year and a half. In addition, 3 other names are loosely associated with the end of the 8th dynasty: Kuakar, Kuyand Aitaru, although the identity, chronological position, and extent of each of their rules is highly uncertain. Kuakar, whose Horus name, Merit, is peculiar for this period, is only known from a limestone lintel, bearing part of his royal titulary, found in Abydos in a building of the 12th dynasty pharaoh, Senusret I.
So Kuika's datation is extremely uncertain. But, as the stone was most likely reused by Senusret I, it's possible Kuika was a nomarch in Abydos, anywhere between the 7th and early 12th dynasties.
Kui was originally a provincial nomarch of Elephantine in Upper Egypt at the very end of the 6th dynasty under Pepi II, who may have taken advantage of the power vacuum following the death of Pepi and the collapse of the Old Kingdom, and proclaimed himself a king of what Manetho referred to as the 7th dynasty.
My money is on the latter, and that would be consistent with the circumstances at the time, especially as his name doesn't appear on any of the kings list. But it is speculation, not evidence.
Kui is not known from any historical sources, the only certain attestation of his existence being a cartouche, the nomen of the hitherto unknown pharaoh, found on a fragmentary relief on a stone block excavated from an almost disappeared mortuary temple discovered immediately north of the main structure in the necropolis of Dara near Manfrahat, 40 kilometers northwest of Asiut in Middle Egypt. The necropolis dominated by a massive funerary structure, which was hastily attributed to this obscure king, the so-called Pyramid of Kui.
Was it or wasn't it? We shall see.
The main structure was first mentioned in French in a 1912 article of The Annals of Service of the Antiquities of Egypt by the Egyptian Egyptologist Ahmed Kamal, who believed it was a huge mastaba. Later, between 1946 and 1948, the complex, that included a mastaba and a mortuary temple, both completely ruined, and the remains of a mud brick perimeter wall that is now under the modern village of Dara, was first explored by the French Egyptologist Raymond Ville, who came to the conclusion the mastaba was a pyramid, attributing it to Kui based on the cartouche found on the stone block in the ruins of the mortuary temple.
That could have been a billboard advertising the original stone merchant.
The ground plan of the main structure, like Netjeriket's step pyramid, is rectangular and measures 146 meters by 136 meters, with the mud brick walls of the pyramid up to 35 meters thick, slanted inwards. This large shell, whose corners are rounded with a radius of curvature of 23 meters, surrounds an empty inner space which was probably filled by sand and gravel.
If the building really was a step pyramid, it would have had a base larger than Nejereket's step pyramid at Saqqara, while in the case of a mastaba, it would have exceeded the size of the already considerable Mastaba el Pharaon of Shepseskaf.
Today, the remains of the structure look similar to the first step of a step pyramid. However, due to the ruined state of the structure and to the building's atypical architecture, in spite of the fact that the building is commonly considered to be a pyramid, or a step pyramid, it is not possible to determine with any certainty, firstly, whether the structure was completed or not, and thus which type of tomb it was, pyramid, step pyramid, or a mastaba, and, secondly, whether it was destroyed or never finished in the first place.
Or that it was a tomb, and all that could have been consistent with the turmoil at the time. Isn't it just as likely that the structure was a mastaba and destroyed by one of any number of possible tsunamis? And if it was, then that's consistent with the evidence we have seen in Upper Egypt, 500 kilometers to the south.
From the north face, a horizontal corridor, whose entrance is at ground level, goes straight into the center of the structure before descending via a vaulted tunnel, lined with limestone, topped by 11 arches. The last part of the corridor reinforced with pilasters, load-bearing sections of thickened wall or column integrated into the wall.
But no mention of granite.
The gallery finally leads to a rectangular burial chamber, measuring 3.5 meters by 7 meters, in the center of the building's base about 8.8 meters below the ground level of the pyramid. Both the corridor and burial chamber are lined with roughly worked limestone blocks, presumably stolen from nearby 6th Dynasty tombs.
Or are they evidence of a hasty repair?
It is because of one of these blocks, containing an offering scene with Kua's name in a cartouche, found in a tomb just south of the pyramid, that it gets its attribution to Kui.
Which means the whole structure, including the subterranean chambers, along with a highly noticeable absence of red granite, may indicate the structure may have been built by Kui sometime after the 6th dynasty, possibly from the rubble of a previously destroyed structure.
The burial chamber, found completely empty during the excavations, was certainly robbed and nearly destroyed in antiquity. It has many similarities with the 3rd Dynasty K1 mastaba of Beit Khalaf, and, consequently, it is impossible to say if anybody had even been buried here.
And maybe it does date back to then. We just don't know.
The layout of the mortuary temple can also not be determined, although the outer part of the masonry consists of a massive mud brick mantle, about 35 meters in length, with the inside probably filled with sand.
So, best we keep digging.
As no name of the owner was found on the actual pyramid site, the identification of Kui as the owner of the complex, although commonly accepted, is still unproven and thus unreliable.
But it's possible Kui repaired and usurped it, building a mortuary temple alongside to stake his claim. But why in Middle Egypt, so far away from Memphis? Was it because he was splitting the distance between Memphis and his home in Aswan? Who knows? And what happened to destroy it? The 4.2 Kiloyear drought wouldn't have done that. So it must have been destroyed much later, perhaps by the tsunami at the end of the 17th dynasty. Again, we don't know. What we do know is that because of the rock-cut structure as part of the tombs of the nobles at Kubet el Hawan, Kui made his mark at Aswan.
Kui had a tomb cut out of the rock, QH34E, on the upper curved section of the Qubit El Herwar cliff. What is notable about this tomb is the visual and physical accessibility of the primary false door, which forms part of the west wall directly opposite the entrance, as is traditional in the necropolis, but it is not set into a recessed niche.
Again, I don't think this is a tomb. Adding a false door in the west wall directly opposite the entrance may well be traditional, but not because it was a tomb, simply so that upon entering the office, visitors could make an offering. I also think the presence of the tomb where it is strongly supports the probability that Kui, as a provincial nomarch of Aswan, most likely did take advantage of the power vacuum created at the death of Pepi II and by the effects of the plague, and that at the very least proclaimed himself a regional ruler. After all, the pharaohs were dropping like flies.
Very little is known about Aitaru, as he is only indirectly attested in the name of a woman called Zeditaru, daughter of Aitaru, the element, Itaru, within the woman's name, written with a royal cartouche, and, as in this period the cartouche was only used for writing a king's name, the for her name must refer to a king. The ruler's name is composed of two elements, Ti and Chenu. Both elements are also well attested as independent names, but the position of the king within the first intermediate period remains highly speculative. Zatayi-Teru, only known from her false door excavated at Saqqara, bore the titles Sole Ornament of the King and Priestess of Hathor. Her actual relation to King Aitjenu is unknown, although it is speculated she was his daughter.
So, it's possible Aitjenu may have been a nomarch, and as the artifact was found at Saqqara, it's possible Aitjenu seized the throne sometime after Neferkare II, after the 8th dynasty had collapsed. But that's just me speculating.
Several kings, such as Teru, are only attested once and their position remains unknown, but some of the acts of the final 4 8th dynasty kings are recorded in their decrees to Shimei, a vizier during this period. In addition, there seems to be room for 2 or 3 more kings as recorded on the list before the end of the dynasty, which indicates that the missing parts of the Turin canon probably contain the kings in the 51st to 55th registers of the Abydos king list.
The lacunae are an open invitation for speculation.
Egyptologists estimate that the 8th dynasty lasted for 20 to 45 years, somewhere between 2190 to 2118 BC, after which the Egyptian state either completely collapsed or the onset of low Nile floods caused a massive famine and chaos that engulfed Egypt, possibly related to a widespread aridification of the Middle East, known as the 4.2 Kiloyear event.
Or all of the above.
In addition, it is believed that during this time, the rise of the numerous nomarchs inevitably created conflicts between neighboring provinces, often resulting in intense rivalries and warfare between them.
Eventually, something had to give.
Recent reappraisal of the archaeological evidence has shown a strong continuity between the 6th and 8th dynasties, so the 8th dynasty, rather than the 6th, should be seen as the last of the Old Kingdom period.
I tend to agree, and based on the name of the pharaohs on the Abydos kings list, the 8th dynasty is most likely a continuation of the 6th dynastic lineage based in Memphis. But what happened next, or should I say at the same time, although 100 kilometres upriver at Heracleopolis?
In spite of close relations between the Memphite kings and powerful nomarchs, notably in Coptos, it is conjectured that the weak rulers of the 8th dynasty were eventually overthrown by a rival group of nomarchs based in Heracleopolis Magna, some 100 miles to the south, just south of Fayum in Lower Egypt at the point where the Nile divides, the lesser branch wandering off into the desert where it eventually vanishes in the Fayum Depression. Eventually, the nomarchs of Heracleopolis became as powerful as the Memphis-based pharaohs and finally, after around 60 years, ousted them from power, claiming the city of Heracleopolis as their capital, proclaiming themselves as the true kings of Egypt and founding the 9th dynasty.
However, although at this time Egypt was not unified, there is the possibility there was an overlap between these and other local dynasties.
Heracleopolis was the name the Ptolemaic Greeks gave to this new capital city, associating it with their god Heracles, so it was Heracles' city. The building projects of the Heracleopolitan kings in the north were very limited, with only one pyramid believed to have been built somewhere at Saqqara, belonging to the 10th dynasty king Merikare.
Believed, but not confirmed.
Also, private tombs that were built during this period pale in comparison to the Old Kingdom monuments, both in quality and size.
Is all this a consequence of what befell ancient Egypt during the Old Kingdom? Perhaps because of the 4.2 Kiloyear event?
Not much is known about the style of art centered in Heracleopolis, because not much is known about the Heracleopolitan kings. There are still relief scenes of servants making provisions for the deceased, as well as the traditional offering scenes, which mirror those of the Old Kingdom Memphite tombs. However, they are of a lower quality and are much simpler than their Old Kingdom parallels. Wooden rectangular coffins were still being used, but their decorations became more elaborate during the rule of the Heracleopolitan kings, with new coffin texts painted on the interiors, providing spells and maps for the deceased to use in the afterlife. Although there is virtually no archaeological evidence concerning the transition, it seems to have involved a drastic reduction to the population in the Nile Valley.
Was all this due to a drought, famine, a plague, caused by the 4.2 Kiloyear event, wiping out the Lower Nile, leaving the rulers of Heracleopolis Magna to step in and pick up the pieces? It might also explain why there is such little archaeological evidence of the early dynasties. No builders. The plot thickens.
Despite ruling for a period of perhaps 185 years, not much is known about the Heracleopolitan rulers, with only one or two exceptions. Almost nothing but the names of the pharaohs and the lengths of the reigns of the 18 or 19 kings who made up Manetho's 9th and 10th dynasties are known.
And what is known is so confusing it barely makes sense. And it is nigh impossible to assign the few named kings to their correct places within the dynastic sequence. We need more evidence.
Egyptologists have differing opinions about the order of succession within the two dynasties, but the Turin canon lists 18 kings for this royal line, although their names are damaged, unidentifiable, or lost. So, just like the 7th and 8th dynasties, confirming the correct chronology of the turbulent times of the 9th and 10th dynasties is far from easy.
They may have been partially concurrent and overlapped with the later rulers of the 8th dynasty and other local rulers. It's even possible that the editors of Manetho's epitome erroneously duplicated the 9th dynasty in the 10th. Who knows? And remember, the ancient Egyptians didn't create the dynasties. They are a much later delineation by Manetho. But let's give it our best shot.
During the 9th dynasty, the country was split into 3 different powers: the Nile Delta, which was exposed to the attacks of the Bedouins and the Asiatics who had started to infiltrate and settle in the Delta, Middle Egypt, the center of power now based at Heracleopolis Magna and including Fayum, Minyar, Asiyut, Sohag upriver to Abydos in the south, which was considered the border, and beyond Abydos, which was in the hands of the nome governors, who were still each powerfully ruling in their own province, trying to increase their power and defeat their rivals.
Egypt was nowhere near a unified country.
The Heracleopolitan dynasty is often called the House of Keshi because many of the rulers' names were Keshi. However, there is confusion as to how many rulers named Keshi, Aktir, may have existed in this period. Some scholars, relying on the Turin canon, count as many as 7, but most of these are unknown in other sources. Among them, only Meri-Iber Keshi and Nebkau-Re Keshi, undoubtedly attested by archaeological finds.
And here is where it all starts to get muddled and confused.
Whilst the Heracleopolitans improved irrigation works and began their coffin texts, they also had frequent outbreaks of fighting against the Thebans, south of Abydos, establishing the importance of Memphis, ultimately expelling the Asiatic immigrants from the Nile Delta to the north, fortifying the eastern border of Egypt, and reopening trade with Byblos. Considered to be fairly unstable due to the frequent changes in rulers, and depending on the source, the number of 9th dynasty rulers is listed as between 4 and 13, with the Turin Papyrus mentioning that the kings of the 9th dynasty ruled for 109 years. Some scholars believe that it was Meri-Iber Keshi I, also possibly called Wakare Keshi I, known by his Horus name Meri-Ibtarvi, who was possibly responsible for the overthrowing of Neferkare II, and who claimed the throne as the founder and first king of the subsequent Heracleopolitan 9th dynasty. According to Manetho, the 9th dynasty was founded at Heracleopolis Magna by Meri-Iber Keshi I, or as Manetho called him Akthos or Aktoi, the head of a powerful family at In-Nasir, the original name for Heracleopolis, who, believing he had gathered enough authority, seized the moment and claimed himself the legitimate successor of both the 6th and 8th dynasty pharaohs, and, for a time, claimed to rule over the whole country. However, this was short-lived and the country rapidly split into 2, the north ruling from Heracleopolis and the south from Thebes.
You can't blame the guy for trying.
Referred to by Manetho as an evil, violent, and tyrannical ruler, more terrible and cruel than his predecessors, and a man who wrought evil things for those in all Egypt, and who caused much harm to the inhabitants of Egypt. Meri-Iber Keshi I ruled over his neighbouring nomarchs with an iron fist before he supposedly went mad at the end of his life, and, according to legend, was attacked by a crocodile and eaten.
This fate is similar to other kings that Manetho felt had ruled cruelly. Menes, who unified Upper and Lower Egypt, was also said to have been devoured by a crocodile. So, as we have already seen in this and previous episodes, Manetho was prone to exaggerate.
Listed as a king in the Turin canon, and one of only 2 rulers whose royal title Ulari is attested by actual archaeological finds, a sort of copper brazier or basket from a tomb near Abydos, an ebony wand from Mir, an ivory casket fragment from Lisht and some other minor finds, Meri-Iber is the most complete amongst the known pharaohs of this period. Some scholars believe that Wakare Keshi may have been a Heracleopolitan prince, who, sometime around 2150 BC, profited from the weakness of the Memphite rulers of the 8th dynasty and violently seized the throne of Middle and Lower Egypt.
I'm sure the death of Pepi II and the 4.2 Kiloyear event had their part in the overthrow as well.
This hypothesis is supported by contemporary inscriptions referring to the Heracleopolitan kingdom as the House of Keshi.
Although that only proves that the founder of the 9th dynasty was Keti, not necessarily Huakare Kiti.
Keshi's cartouche, inscribed with coffin texts, also appears on a 12th dynasty wooden coffin, found in Deir el-Bersher, originally made for a steward named Nefri. On it, Huakare Keshi's name was found in place of Nefri's, but it is unknown if the texts were originally inscribed for the king, or if they were simply copied later from an earlier source.
So the coffin dates at least as early as the 9th dynasty, possibly as early as the time of Nefri, whenever that was.
Alternatively, other Egyptologists identify Huakare with the Keshi who was the alleged author of the famous Teaching for King Merikare, thus placing him in the 10th dynasty between Neferkare VIII and Merikare. In this reconstruction, Huakare is the last Heracleopolitan king bearing the name Keshi, and Akthos, founder of the 9th dynasty, is identified with Meri-Ibre Keshi of the 10th dynasty, and the House of Keshi must refer to him instead.
Isn't it possible that what's referred to as the 9th and 10th dynasties may simply have been separate nomes? And that maybe Huakare Keti, or that the 9th and 10th dynasties were in fact one and the same?
From the instructions, it is known that Huakare Keti, in alliance with the nomarchs of Lower Egypt, managed to repel the nomadic Asiatics, the Berbers, who, for generations, had roamed the Nile Delta. Those nomarchs, although recognizing Huakare's overall authority, ruled de facto, more or less independently.
Supporting my proposition that the different dynasties may well have been the rulers of different separate nomes.
Huakare's expulsion of the Asiatics allowed the establishment of new settlements and defense structures on the northeastern borders, as well as the reprise of trades with Byblos and the Levantine coast. However, Huakare warned Merikare, possibly his son, not to neglect guarding these borders, as their Asiatics was still considered a danger. Originally planned towards the end of the First Intermediate Period, Huakare, Keti II, chose the same area as his predecessor Itibi, at Asiyut Level 6, where the mountain has the best quality of stone, and was therefore ideal for constructing a tomb.
If it was originally meant to be a tomb, it was also the perfect location for an administrative building.
The unfinished tomb has been excavated several times since the late 19th century, most recently from 2003 to 2006, yielding interesting results concerning the tomb's architectural features and history, presenting us with a good example to reconstruct the process of tomb building during the First Intermediate Period.
So, let's see what we find.
The facade of Keti II's tomb was fronted by a forecourt that was destroyed in the first quarter of the 19th century and which has not yet been excavated.
Like we saw in episode 11 with Meku and his son Sabni at Kubet el Hawa. Since when do tombs have forecourts? Offices? Yes. Tombs? No.
The central axis of the hall, which is more or less rectangular, measuring 18.8 meters long by 10.1 meters wide by 3.9 meters high, with a floor space of about 147 square meters, is perpendicular to the lost entrance wall. The ceiling is supported by two pairs of rock-cut pillars. The northern pillar of the eastern pair is broken away, while the suspended upper part of the other, southern pillar is preserved, showing remains of incised hieroglyphs surmounted by an incised Hake-frieze decoration. Of the western pair of pillars, both unfinished and only roughly executed, one is still standing, while the other became a victim of later quarrying activities.
That's a lot of damage. Quarrying? There are those pesky stone thieves again. Or was it an earthquake? Or a flood?
The front third of the hall is broader than the middle and the rear. The eastern part of northern wall decorated with a long autobiographical text in incised hieroglyphs filled with blue paint. An incised Hake-frieze forms the top border of the relief, the text accompanied by figures of the tomb owner and a priestess of Hathor named Itibi, whose relationship to the tomb owner is not stated.
Maybe because it's not a tomb. It's an office.
The autobiographical text on the northern wall of Keti II's tomb chapel gives rich information about the fight for Asiut between, on the one hand, King Merikare of Heracleopolis, allied with Keti II, and, on the other, the Theban forces, the essential points being, Keti II seems to have originally been driven out of Asiut, but, with the support of the Heracleopolitan King Merikare, he managed to push back the Theban aggressors and regain possession of his territory.
You did convey him a river, the heaven was cleared for him, the whole land was with him, the counts of Middle Egypt, and the great guns of Heracleopolis. The district of the queen of the land came to repel the Kiloyear. The land trembled, Upper Egypt bailed water. All people winced, the villages in panic. Fear entered into their limbs. The land burned in its flame. The head of the fleet extended to Satb, and its end to Gogo-Herjei. Heaven was blowing the north wind. Papyrus fell on the water. Heracleopolis was landing. Welcome, the town cried jubilantly to its ruler. The son of a ruler, women together with men. The Ariolar son reached his town. He entered his Ephetecher's territory. He brought back the refugees into their homes. He buried his old people.
The fact that Keti II was driven out of Asiut for some indefinite period and resumed the war after his return might explain the unfinished state of the tomb, if it was in fact a tomb.
As for the south wall, a passage was cut into the eastern end of it at a later period to connect this tomb with the adjoining tomb.
Just like in the tombs of Meku and his son Sabni at Kubet el-Huwa. So, was this a corridor connecting two offices?
Further along, beyond a narrow projecting shoulder, the south wall is decorated, in sunk relief, with a Hake-frieze and, below it, marching soldiers armed with battle axes and shields in 3 rows, of which the 3rd row is unfinished.
Surely the fact it is unfinished is a clear indication of the times.
At some later point in time, in the same south wall, 2 rectangular niches were cut underneath the relief. Whilst the western end of the tomb was left unlevelled and rough cut at a level higher than general floor level of the hall.
It sounds like the space was converted into a Coptic church, but when that was done and why is not known.
During the 2004-2005 dig, the fill, consisting of limestone chips of different sizes, in some layers mixed with Nile silt and other remains of bones, reeds, bandages and other small objects, which formed a nearly horizontal surface in the large inner hall, was removed, revealing several steps hewn into the rock and 2 previously unknown shafts.
Nile silt, a horizontal surface at the height of level 6 of the tomb? That's quite a find. What was the silt made of? What did it comprise? How deep was it?
The first, east of the southeastern pillar, measuring 3.4 meters by 1.7 meters with a depth of 5 meters, leads to a burial chamber cut into its south side. The second, east of the southwest pillar, measures 3.3 meters by 1.4 with a depth of 9.4, leads to 3 burial chambers cut into its south side and 2 burial chambers cut into the northern side.
Burial chambers. I still doubt it. It would make much more sense if they were simply subterranean chambers used to store offerings and valuables.
There is some evidence that the construction of both shafts was already completed at the end of the First Intermediate Period, but both shafts were already plundered in antiquity, the existence of the chambers and shaft 2 pointing to a later reuse as a tomb.
A later use, not the original purpose.
Both shafts produced many objects dating to different periods, ranging from artifacts which might belong to the original inventory to remnants of later burials and the reuse of the tomb.
Artifacts from different periods, and the later reusing of the shafts for burials, not originally as a tomb.
Numerous objects, such as pottery, a completely preserved 13.5 centimeter by 5.9 centimeter hemispherical cup, an offering tray made of clay, fragments of wooden models, and bricks of sizes typical for the First Intermediate Period, were found in front of the burial chamber of the first shaft, clear indications suggesting a burial dated to the First Intermediate Period to the end of the Middle Kingdom. They also indicate the tomb was probably plundered between the end of the First Intermediate Period and the Amarna period.
Although the dating may be correct, the proposed usage is pure speculation. But why the Amarna period?
After the complete removal of the fill, it became apparent that the bedrock floor of the hall was not a flat surface but a rather irregular one. It also revealed that the original 4 centimeter long chisel marks on the rough-cut rectangular pillars, typical for the Coptic era and dating to the original tomb architecture, were vastly different to the 20 centimeter long parallel chisel marks on the walls and the steps, cut around the shafts that formed the fishbone pattern and marks identical to the dimensions of talatarts, those recognizable in the quarries of the 18th dynasty.
The talatats being specifically linked to Akhenaten and Amarna,
which suggests that some architectural changes took place.
Meaning the site was not only reused, it was most likely repurposed.
Because of the contrasting opinions of scholars, Meri-Ibre Keti's reign is difficult to account and date with any reliability. If he really was the founder of the 9th dynasty, his reign should have conventionally begun around 2160 BCE, while, in the second case, his reign should have started about a century later.
Unless they were running concurrently, which raises the question of whether the 10th dynasty may even have predated the 9th dynasty. Who knows, because there is such little actual evidence. The lineage of the whole First Intermediate Period is open to speculation and conjecture.
Due to a large lacuna, the name of the next ruler is missing from the Turin canon and little is known of his reign, although a few artifacts bearing his name survive.
It's even possible he was Keti II's father and predated him. But let's move on.
Although Neferkare is not included on the Abydos king list or the Sarkarar king list, nor can the existence of his reign be positively confirmed through any archaeological finds, according to the Turin king list, Neferkare VIII was the third pharaoh of the 9th dynasty, the prenomen Neferkare suggesting, much like the many namesake Memphite kings of the 8th dynasty, that he considered himself a legitimate successor of the last ruler of the 6th dynasty, Pepi II Neferkare. In some literature, he is called Neferkare VIII because he likely was the 7th king to bear this name, although many of his predecessors are now called by a combination of their prenomen and nomen. For example, Neferkare Nebi or Neferkare Pepiseneb.
The association of names to bloodlines makes sense. But does it just apply to the men? I think not. And I'm going to have a much closer look at that when we get to the 18th dynasty later in the series.
It is also possible Neferkare was also Carnefere, who is mentioned in an obscure and isolated tomb inscription in the tomb of the nomarch Ankhtifi, the pro-Heracleopolite nomarch of Hierakonpolis and Prince of El Moaller, about 30 kilometers south of Thebes. If Neferkare and Carnefere were the same pharaoh, then his authority is sometimes presumed from Ankhtifi's inscription to have extended at least over Elephantine, Edfu, and Hierakonpolis, the capitals of the first 3 nomes of Upper Egypt. However, the inscription in question simply states,
«Με η χώρας μπρίνε good inundation φόρχισαν και ζεφριόε».
Uncertainty about the verb tense in the inscription has led to disagreement among scholars as to whether this named pharaoh would have ruled in Ankhtifi's youth, or at the time of the events he describes, or indeed if it were not a king before Ankhtifi's time, who had ruled toward the end of the Old Kingdom from Memphis.
It's all speculation.
Many Egyptologists assign Nebkhaure Kheti II, otherwise known as Nebkhaure Arktoi, as the 4th king of the 9th dynasty, just after Neferkare, and the 2nd king bearing the name Kheti. Other scholars believe instead that Nebkhaure reigned during the subsequent 10th dynasty, possibly before Meriyebre Kheti.
Or, if the so-called dynasties were nomes, he ruled in both.
Tentatively placed in the register of the Turin king list, the only contemporary object bearing his cartouche is a weight made from red jasper, unearthed by Flinders Petrie at Tel El Retabar, in Wadi Chumalat of the Eastern Delta. And, although Nebkhaure Kheti II is only the 2nd ruler of this period attested by actual archaeological finds, like many of the kings who preceded or succeeded him, those attestations are scant, the most famous being the name of a king, Nebkhaure, on a late Middle Kingdom papyrus containing part of the well-known and popular story, The Eloquent Peasant.
However, due to the contrasting opinions of scholars, practically nothing is known of the events of Nebkhaure's reign. Even dating it is difficult.
Kheti II, or possibly an earlier king of the same name, appears to have held sway over much of Middle and Upper Egypt, as his name is found in inscriptions north of the First Cataract.
We don't know for certain of the names or the numbers. It's all open to speculation and conjecture.
There is no contemporary archaeological find attesting to the existence of Setit, and he is only known from the Turin king list, where his incomplete name, Sainan, appears. An unknown king of the same dynasty, whose name is lost, succeeded him. He, in turn, followed by a ruler whose name, Meri something, is incomplete, possibly Meri Hathor. Meri Hathor's existence is also doubtful, known only from a damaged piece of graffiti at Hatnub.
A lost rule, a scant reference. Was it here with Meri Hathor that there was a further split, a disharmony in proceedings?
The 9th dynasty continues with a number of incomplete and missing or lost names. Shed something, H something, followed by 3 lost names. The dynasty ending with either user something or Imhotep, a short-lived ruler of the 9th dynasty only known from 2 rock inscriptions at Wadi Hammamet, with his correct chronological position unknown.
Surely it has to be considered that the 9th dynasty was also a victim of the 4.2 Kiloyear event and possibly the plague.
Mary Hathor is, however, also listed as the first king of the 10th dynasty.
So let's examine the evidence.
The rulers of the 10th dynasty were ruling from Anasyr, Heracleopolis. However, the capitals were still weak and the Nome governors continued to enjoy complete authority and independence in their provinces. Thus, the country was in a complete chaos and lost its central authority. In the 10th dynasty, Mary Hathor is succeeded by Neferkare VIII. Not known from any archaeological finds, Neferkare VIII's only attestation is on the Turin king list as the second pharaoh of the 10th dynasty. The prenomen, Neferkare, suggests he considered himself a legitimate successor of Pepi II Neferkare of the 6th dynasty, much like many of the namesake Memphite kings of the 8th dynasty.
And there's no reason to believe he wasn't.
Most likely the 8th king to bear the Neferkare name. Neferkare VIII ruled from Anasyr sometime between 2130 and 2040 BC. Although many of his predecessors are sometimes called by a combination of their prenomen and nomen, for example, Neferkare Teru or Neferkare Kendu, like many of the namesake Memphite kings of the 8th dynasty, it is presumed Neferkare VIII's use of the prenomen, Neferkare, suggests he considered himself a legitimate successor of Pepi II Neferkare of the 6th dynasty.
Adding to the confusion.
Known from the wall inscriptions in the tomb of Ankh-Tfi to be the governor of the first 3 southern nomes, Elephantine, Edfu and Armant, Neferkare's tomb records a famine in Upper Egypt and that by distributing corn Neferkare found a way to save them.
The famine most likely caused by the 4.2 Kiloyear event.
It has been proposed that Neferkare VIII and the enigmatic king Karnefere mentioned in the tomb of the nomarch Ankh-Tfi are the same person, but it has also been speculated it is more likely that Karnefere should rather be identified with Neferkare VII of the previous 9th dynasty.
Who knows?
The successor of Neferkare at Anasyr, Wakare Keshi III, is also known as Arktoi IV. Wakare's first mission was to clear the delta from the Bedouins, and then turn to Upper Egypt to deal with the Thebans.
Clearly, Egypt was far from unified.
It was in the south that Wakare, initially supported by the faithful nomarch of Asiut, Tefi B, engaged in a war with and retook the city of Thinis, near Abydos, which had previously been captured by the Thebans, led by Intef II. However, the troops of Heracleopolis, in doing so, sacked the sacred necropolis of Thinis, a serious crime, which was even sadly reported by Wakare himself. This crime caused the immediate reaction of the Thebans, who regained control under the leadership of Imhotep, Wakare Intef II, who restored the fortress of Thinis under his control, and moved northwards until he captured the city of Kom Ishkau, Aphroditopolis, in the 10th nome of Upper Egypt, thus reaching the borders of Asiut and later finally capturing the Thinite nome. Wakare is the purported author of the text, Teaching for King Merikare, a collection of precepts for good governance written for his son and successor, Merikare. In the text, Wakare Keshi mentions having sacked Thinis, and that the eastern borders have been recently secured, but advises Merikare to deal more leniently with the troublesome Upper Egyptian realms.
I think it's a fact to say the evidence leans towards there being competing rulers in conflicting nomes rather than separate dynasties. but how these rulers were related, if at all, is unknown.
After the battles, Kheti decided to abandon his confrontational policy and begin a phase of peaceful coexistence with the Southern Kingdom.
Probably because he got his butt whipped.
Although he never gained the true power and influence of the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom, Kheti brought a degree of stability and order to Egypt which endured for many years, until at least part way into the reign of his successor, Merikare, the son of Arctoy IV, who succeeded Kheti's lengthy reign of 5 decades. Identified as Kheti's son and successor, Merikare, also referred to as Merikare and Merikarar, came to the throne in his middle age, at the death of his father and towards the end of the 10th dynasty around 2075 BC. Once crowned, Merikare, purportedly inspired by the teaching of his father, wisely resigned himself to the existence of 2 separate kingdoms, the Heracleopolite and the Theban ones, and focused on improving the prosperity of his realm, centered in Heracleopolis, instead of waging an open war with Thebes, trying to maintain the policy of semi-peaceful coexistence with the southern 11th dynasty rivals achieved by his father.
Surely he didn't honestly believe that peace would last.
It seems that the period of peace brought a certain amount of prosperity to Merikare's realm, but his policy didn't last long. For several months after Merikare died, around 2040 BC, the Thebans, led by the powerful governor Mentuhotep II of the 11th dynasty, seized the opportunity and conquered Heracleopolis, the defeat most likely inflicted upon a short-lived, unnamed successor, marking the beginning of the Middle Kingdom,
which we will look at in detail in the next episode.
Despite the fact his name cannot be recognized in the Turin King list, Merikare is the most attested among the rulers of Heracleopolis, his name appearing in the text of the teaching for King Merikare, on a wooden scribe pallet belonging to the Chancellor Kheti, along with a brazier dedicated to Merikare Kheti, both found in a tomb near Asiut, and on 9 stelae attesting the existence of his pyramid and his funerary cult in Saqqara. Presumed to be the burial place of the Heracleopolitan pharaoh Merikare, the only attested pyramid of a king belonging to the Heracleopolitan dynasties, the pyramid of Merikare remains unidentified.
Perhaps because he never built one.
That the pyramid exists is known by 9 inscriptions on the funerary steles of 12th dynasty priests, 8 of which are from northern Saqqara, while the 9th is of unknown origin. From those inscriptions it is known that the ancient name of the pyramid was Wat Sut Merikare, variously translated as flourishing at the abodes of Merikare or the fresh places of Merikare. All these inscriptions were found in the tombs of priests, and at least 4 of these priests were responsible for the funerary cult of both kings Merikare and the earliest 6th dynasty king, Teti, demonstrating that the funerary cults of these kings remained active during the Middle Kingdom and, most importantly, that Merikare's pyramid must have been in the vicinity of the Pyramid of Teti in Saqqara. Many sources suggest that Merikare was buried in the yet undiscovered pyramid somewhere in Saqqara, purported to be near to the Pyramid of Teti of the 6th dynasty.
Suggestions, speculations, but no factual evidence. What if there's no pyramid because they never built one?
It was speculated to be located on the southeast corner of the Teti pyramid. However, that later turned out to be the small cult pyramid of Teti's pyramid complex.
Or is it?
Another hypothesis emerged in the second half of the 20th century identifying the Pyramid of Merikare with the Lepsius Pyramid number 29, located in Saqqara North, more commonly known as the Headless Pyramid, although this hypothesis was later rejected in 1979 by some scholars who proposed that the headless pyramid more likely belongs to the 5th dynasty pharaoh Menkaure, the only 5th dynasty ruler whose pyramid had not been identified formally.
It's polyphylla archaeology.
Arguments continue amongst Egyptologists, based on the absence of similar burials dating to the 5th dynasty, as well as the construction materials employed, even that Menkaure is the only pharaoh of the 5th dynasty whose pyramid had not been identified. As to who built the pyramid, Menkaure or Menkaure.
What if they're all wrong? What if there's not a single pyramid that was built by a dynastic ruler? What if all they did was repair them and then usurp them, building a funerary temple beside them?
The titles of the officials involved in its construction are documented, as his funerary cult endured into the 12th dynasty. In fact, Menkaure's cartouche appears on the stelae of at least 4 priests who were responsible for the funerary cult of Teti and Menkaure during the Middle Kingdom. So the existence of his pyramid has historically been ascertained, it just hasn't been discovered.
Yet. So it's possible, like most of the rulers of the Old Kingdom dynasties that we examined in the 4 previous episodes, that Menkaure usurped a pre-existing structure and built a mortuary temple alongside it. But where is it? Perhaps if the star map theory proves to align, then we just may find it.
After Menkaure's death, it is most likely Arctoi V succeeded to the throne, and, during his time, the story of the eloquent peasant might have occurred, however, while the story was set around Heracleopolis. In the 9th and 10th dynasties, it is generally accepted that the poem itself was written around 1850 BCE during the Middle Kingdom, around the same time as the Tale of Sinew, making it one of the longest Egyptian tales that has survived completed. Described as an elaborate reflection on the connection or disconnection of ethical order and refined speech, the tale is a compilation of 4 incomplete manuscripts believed to all be versions of the same story, but that have some conflict in overlapping sections. Like most stories, it is implied that different people told the story in different ways, leading to some discrepancies in written versions. Meanwhile, the Thebans continued their war until they achieved complete victory over the Heracleopolitans.
Which sounds a lot like Menkaure Kheti I.
Thus, the Middle Kingdom came under the control of one king as the 11th dynasty started to take over the throne.
Which puts it at the time of Mentuhotep II and the 11th dynasty. But let's leave that until part 2. And in part 2, let's also look at the southern Theban rulers, who ruled in parallel to both the Memphite and the Heracleopolitan cities. In part 1 of this episode, we've examined and reviewed the first half of the approximately 125-year First Intermediate Period. And what we discovered was that the political instability and rapidly disintegrating power of the throne, fueled by the rising power of the provincial nomarchs of the 6th dynasty, inevitably created conflicts between neighbouring provinces, which eventually led to rivalries and conflicts and wars between them. The resultant so-called 7th and 8th dynasties that emerged, rather than being a sequential family lineage of the rule of one bloodline, were instead at least 3 separate and often parallel centres of power of numerous unrelated bloodlines, each ruled by local kings competing for supremacy that encompassed the length of the Nile, ruling from Memphis in the north, the seat of power in the Old Kingdom and Dynasties 7 and 8, and Heracleopolis in Middle Egypt just south of Fayum. Further, Following on from our exploration in episode 12, we discovered that the chaos of the first intermediate period may well have been triggered and driven by a massive global climatic disaster known as the 4.2 Kiloyear event. An event around 2500 BC that involved meteorite strikes, multiple volcanic eruptions, floods and droughts. So join me in part 2 as we continue our journey down the Nile and we examine the second half of the first intermediate period, that being the 11th and 12th dynasties.